The gates opened with a metallic groan that morning, and Richard R.B., who'd stepped into a blinding Texas sun that felt almost foreign. He clutched a small plastic bag there, some of 10 years. Behind bars and stared at the road that stretched past razor wire and silence. No one waited for him. The bus driver barely glanced as he climbed aboard. For the first time in a decade, freedom felt heavier than the chains he had just lost. Houston's skyline shimmered in the distance, all glass and promise, but for a man with a record, it might as well have been another planet. He slept under bridges that smelled of exhaust and rain, worked odd jobs that paid in cash and asked no questions, and kept his head low, haunted by the voices of friends who never made it out. The concrete was cold at night, the summer heat unbearable by day. Each night he whispered the same prayer into the darkness. If you still see me, God, give me a reason to wake up tomorrow. Weeks passed, then months, until one Sunday morning he followed the sound of a choir echoing down a side street. The church doors were open, light spilling through like mercy itself, warm and golden against the worn steps. Hood sat in the back pew, still smelling of the street. His clothes wrinkled and stained, afraid someone would ask him to leave. Instead, a gray-haired usher with kind eyes placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Son, you're already home." For the first time in years, Arby wept without shame, his shoulders shaking as something long buried broke open inside him. The pastor's sermon that day wasn't about punishment or condemnation, it was about purpose, about second chances, about being chosen even in brokenness. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. At first, his faith was clumsy and uncertain, like learning to walk again after years of stillness. He swept floors in the church kitchen, the broom handle smooth and familiar in his calloused hands. He helped stack food boxes for the homeless ministry, lifting cans and bread with the same hands that once did darker things. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the rhythm of grace that moved through the congregation like breath. The work was simple, repetitive, grounding, and it began to rebuild something inside him he thought was dead. But as he worked, he noticed something missing in the prayers and programs. Men like him, men who had fallen hard, repented deeply, and returned to a world with no door open, no roof waiting. He saw them at the bus stop, eyes hollow with the same despair he'd carried, wearing the invisible mark that kept employers from calling back. "We build churches," he told the pastor one night after service, his voice steady but urgent. "But what about roofs for the lost?" That question lodged itself deep in his chest, growing heavier each day until it became more than a question. The pastor listened, nodded slowly, and said something that changed everything. "Then build them." It wasn't permission, it was a commission. Arby walked home that night under a sky full of stars he'd never noticed before, his mind spinning with impossible visions. He had no money, no property, no construction license, just a conviction burning in his bones. That seed of an idea, place where men could rebuild their lives. While rebuilding walls would not let him rest. In the weeks that followed, he prayed for clarity and received it in the most unlikely form. An abandoned duplex in Houston's Fifth Ward. The neighborhood had seen better days, scarred by neglect and poverty, but Arby saw something else. Where others saw rot and danger-boarded windows, collapsed porches, graffiti-stained walls, he saw redemption waiting to be hammered back into shape. It was broken, yes, but so was he, and somehow, that made it perfect. When Arby found that abandoned duplex, most people shook their heads and crossed the street. The structure leaned slightly, its wood warped by years of rain and heat, its foundation cracked but still holding. Broken glass littered the yard where weeds grew waist-high. But Hood walked through those rooms with a builder's eye and a believer's heart, seeing not what it was but what it could become. With borrowed tools and donated paint, he fixed one room, then another, working from dawn until his hands bled and his back screamed for rest. A local contractor heard about the crazy ex-con fixing up the old duplex and dropped off leftover wood planks, still good, just surplus. A retired nurse brought blankets, linens that smelled of lavender and hope. A church member donated a used stove. Another brought dishes. Within months, the first residents, 2 men, straight out of the same prison he'd left, blinking in the light of a second chance, moved in. He called the place Home of Amazing Grace, the name rising from a song he hummed while hammering broken frames back into place. That old hymn about being lost and found. The name stuck like paint on his hands, simple and true. Grace wasn't a theory. Here it was in the walls, in the floors swept clean, in the keys handed to men society had written off. Every nail he drove felt like an act of worship. Every door he repaired opened onto a future that hadn't existed the day before. He taught the residents to do the work themselves, how to patch drywall, fix a leaking faucet, replace a broken window, not just so they could maintain the house, but so they could carry the skill into a life beyond these walls. The work was slow and exhausting, but it was sacred. He saw transformation happening in real time, not just in the houses, but in the men. A former addict learned to measure twice and cut once, learning patience in the process. A man who'd lost everything to violence discovered he could create instead of destroy. They worked side by side, sweat mixing with sawdust, building something tangible when everything else felt uncertain. And at night, after the tools were put away, they gathered around a table for scripture and simple meals, finding fellowship in the shared understanding that they'd all been given a gift they didn't deserve. The city took notice when his small duplex turned into 3 houses, then 6, each one marked by fresh paint and the sound of hammers at dawn. Local news cameras arrived one afternoon, filming RB in sweat-soaked clothes, standing beside walls still smelling of new paint and possibility. When I walked out of those gates, he told KHOU11 reporters, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand, I had nothing but God had a plan. His voice was steady, humble, but carried the weight of undeniable truth. Former inmates began showing up by the dozen, not looking for pity, but for purpose. For a chance to prove they were more than their worst days, he taught them to repair roofs, laying shingles in the brutal Texas sun. He taught them to paint with steady hands, to cook meals that fed more than just hunger. And every evening before dinner, they read scripture together, in a circle, psalms about valleys and shadows, about being lifted from pits, about steadfast love that never fails. The routine gave structure to men who'd lived for years in chaos. It gave dignity to those who'd forgotten they were worthy of it. And slowly, one repaired wall at a time, they began to believe that maybe they could build a life worth living. Faith didn't erase the past. It repurposed it, turning scars into stories and pain into purpose. The same strength that once kept RB alive behind bars, the ability to endure, to survive another day when hope seemed foolish, now built houses instead of walls around his heart. The discipline learned in confinement became discipline in construction. The hunger for meaning that drove him to crime now drove him to create. He was the same man, but remade, not erased, but redeemed. And that difference mattered more than he could say. City officials, who once ignored him, started calling for advice on re-entry programs, asking how a man with no degree had achieved what their funded initiatives could not. A Houston councilwoman said on camera, her voice filled with genuine admiration, RB Hood is what happens when faith becomes policy. The statement made headlines. Yet every night, after the cameras left and the volunteers went home, RB still prayed the same simple words he'd whispered under bridges. Thank you for trusting me with another day. The gratitude never faded, never became routine, because he remembered too well what it felt like to have nothing. Not even tomorrow. His biggest test came when a storm flooded half the neighborhood, tearing roofs off 2 of his transitional homes with winds that screamed like fury. Rain poured through gaping holes, ruining beds and soaking floors they'd just refinished. The men who lived there gathered around him in the mud, water up to their ankles, expecting orders, waiting for someone to tell them what to do. Instead, RB grabbed a hammer from his truck, pointed at the torn sky, still spitting rain, and said, with a grin that surprised even himself, "We rebuilt because he rebuilt us." For 3 days straight, they worked shoulder to shoulder, singing hymns between thunderclaps, their voices rising over the sound of hammers and wind. By Sunday, the homes stood again, patched stronger and shining with wet light that seemed to promise better days. They'd worked through exhaustion, through doubt, through the voices that said it was pointless. But standing there in the morning sun, looking at roofs that held firm, they understood something deeper than construction. They'd proven to themselves that broken things could be made whole, that storms don't have to mean the end, that faith isn't about avoiding hardship, it's about standing back up when everything falls apart. And in that moment, covered in mud and sweat and grace, they were no longer just ex-cons or outcasts. They were builders. Donations began pouring in after the storm. People moved by what they'd witnessed. Churches partnered with Home of Amazing Grace, sending volunteers and funds and prayers. Local business owners offered job training, welding, carpentry, electrical work, giving men skills that translated into real careers. Former residents returned as mentors, proof that the cycle could be broken, that redemption wasn't a fairy tale. A program born from one man's prayer grew into a network of shelters stretching beyond Houston, each one a small miracle of wood and faith. Yet RB refused to take credit for any of it, always quick to deflect praise toward heaven. "It's not mine," he told a reporter who asked about his success, his voice firm but gentle. "It's his project. I'm just the contractor." The humility wasn't false. Modesty, it was the truth as he understood it. He'd been broken, empty, ready to give up. And somehow, in ways he still couldn't fully explain, God had taken that brokenness and used it to shelter hundreds. Every house they built, every man they helped, every meal they shared, it all pointed back to a grace he didn't earn and couldn't take credit for. He was just the one who showed up with a hammer and said yes. The ministry expanded, opening new locations, serving more people, earning recognition from civic leaders and faith communities alike. But RB kept working with his hands, often found late at night repairing faucets or reading psalms to men just out of county jail. He remembered their faces because he'd worn the same expression, lost, afraid, angry at a world that had no place for them, and he'd sit with them in dim kitchens, over coffee that was too strong and too sweet, and tell them the truth. "You're not too far gone. I was where you are. And if God could use me, He can use you too." Each home carried a single inscription above its doorway, hand-carved and painted gold. "Grace lives here." When a television crew asked him why he never removed the old prison tattoo on his arm, a crude number, a permanent reminder, he smiled. "Because that's proof of the before," he said, tracing the faded ink with his other hand. "God doesn't erase our scars. He signs them." The statement resonated with viewers across the state. People wrote letters, shared their own stories, thanked him for showing them that the past didn't have to define the future. He kept working long after the cameras left, because the work was never really about the cameras at all. Today, hundreds of people call Home of Amazing Grace their first address after prison or homelessness. The walls are painted soft yellow, warm and welcoming even on gray days. Every room smells faintly of cedar and soap, clean and hopeful. On weekends, children play soccer in the lot that used to be a dumping ground, a patch of grass where broken bottles once lay, now rings with laughter and shouted goals. And when RB walks by, moving slower now but still steady, they call him Mr. Hood. Not ex-con, not by his number. To them, he's the man who gave their fathers back a reason to stand tall. In his small office, really just a converted bedroom with a desk and filing cabinet, hangs a rusted keychain he carried the day he was released. It's worthless, just metal and memories, but he keeps it visible. A daily reminder of how far God can rebuild from nothing. Some mornings he holds it in his palm, feeling its weight, remembering the terror and hope of that first morning outside the gates, and then he sets it down and gets back to work, because there are still men waiting, still houses that need building, still grace that needs extending to the ones who think they're too broken to be loved. RB often says, to reporters and residents alike, that he still wakes up with the same prayer he spoke on his first night free. "Lord, don't just fix my life. Use it." It's a prayer he whispers in the dark before dawn breaks over Houston. before the hammers start and the work begins again. He asked to be made useful, to have his brokenness transformed into something beautiful, and somehow, in ways that defy simple explanation, his prayer was answered. Not with wealth or fame or comfort, but with purpose, the kind that echoes beyond one life, rippling outward to touch hundreds, thousands, men who needed to know they weren't forgotten. Every house built is a sermon without words. Every man given a second chance is proof of a grace that doesn't quit. And every sunrise over the Fifth Ward gold, spilling across rooftops that wouldn't exist without faith reminds RB that he didn't choose this work. It chose him. Or rather, God chose him, saw him stumbling out of those prison gates with nothing, and decided to build something eternal from the rubble. That truth sustains him when the work gets hard, when the budget runs short, when another man relapses or gives up or runs back to old habits. Because if God could take a broken man with a criminal record and turn him into a builder of homes and hope, then nothing and no one is beyond redemption. The inscription above each door isn't just decoration, it's a promise, spoken over every threshold. Grace lives here, and in the morning light, with hammers ringing and prayers rising and men learning to build not just houses but lives worth living, that promise becomes flesh. Grace takes on hands and calluses and sweat. It smells like fresh paint and sawdust. It sounds like hymns sung off-key by men who never knew they could sing. And it looks like RB Hood, standing in a yard full of homes that shouldn't exist, built by men who were told they'd never amount to anything, proving that when God decides to rebuild, he starts with the most unlikely foundations. This account is based on reporting by KHOU 11 and KPRC2 in Houston, which documented the real-life story of Richard R.B. Hood and his ministry, the home of amazing grace. Once a prisoner, and now a builder of hope, Hood's journey shows that redemption through faith can turn even broken walls into shelter for the soul. His work continues today in Houston's Fifth Ward, where hundreds have found not just housing, but home, a place where grace doesn't just live in words, but in every nail driven, every door opened, every second chance given to men the world had written off as beyond saving.